Go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to this Art Information Commons Learning Opportunity session. For those of you who don't know me, I am Kristen Regina, the Arcadia Director of the Library and Archives here at the PMA, and I'm the Principal Investigator of the Commons Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Commons is a 3-year planning grant that the Library and Archives received from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to reconsider knowledge management in the museum sector by building a community forum and lab for furthering our data strategies, best practices, and tools. It is a collaborative, technology-agnostic exploration to leverage and evolve the existing ways PMA creates, shares, and stores its art information across the institution. Today's presentation is by David Newbury, Enterprise Software and Data Architect at the J. Paul Getty Trust, who will discuss his work at the intersection of data, technology, and the fine arts to find common solutions to technical and scholarly problems. David has worked on collaborative museum technology projects such as Art Tracks, the Visualization Provenance Project, the American Art Collaborative, which was integrating data across 14 museums, the Carnegie Mellon University, the University of British Columbia, the University of Illinois, and PBS. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David for his talk.
Thank you all so much for having me here. Thank you to Kristen and to Bill and to everyone at PMA who's given me a really wonderful opportunity over the past 2 days to talk and to think about the Art Commons and other work that's going on here. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to all of you and to sort of share a little bit about what I've learned over the past 5 or 6 years as I try to figure out how can I use the skills that I have as a technologist to think through some of the problems that we all deal with as we work to take the information that we have and make it available to the world. So I'm the Enterprise Software Architect at the J. Paul Getty Trust. What that means is that my role is to take the various parts of the Getty, which is an archive and a library, a conservation science lab, a publishing house, a museum, a foundation, and say, how can I take all of these different things that we do and combine them together and to say, what can we do to make all of this information available using the tools that I have, which are software and data. I don't have money, I don't have people, I have these tools that you use by sitting and typing. And so what can you do with typing? What can you do with computers to make the world of art more available and accessible to people? And I'm coming at this not with an art history degree. I'm not a PhD. I'm a software developer. In a previous life, I was a filmmaker. The closest I ever came was working for American Eagle Outfitters, designing data models and APIs to help sell underwear. And I ended up in this world because I'd done a whole bunch of data visualization work. And someone said, can you talk about the history, can you visualize the history of ownership of art? And I said, oh, that'll be wonderful. That's easy. I can do a map. I can do a timeline. I know everything. This will be 3 months. It'll get me out of the clothing business. And over the next 3 years, I learned how incredibly interesting the information contained within organizations like this are. And I started learning what it takes to take the knowledge that is in a room like this and try to make it amenable to the kind of work that I do. And so there really are 2 parts to my job. One part is data, and one part is software. And I want to start out today by talking about the first of those, which is data. When we think about data, what we're thinking about is information, knowledge that we have, knowledge that we know, but we want it to not only be just known, we want it to be structured. We all know lots and lots of things, but unless we can put them in some sort of rigorous, defined format, it's not useful. And that's the other half of what makes data different from just information. It's structured, and it's structured to enable some particular kind of use. And so I want to talk about some of the different ways that we can use information. And as a computer scientist, as a developer, traditionally what we do is we tell stories, and we tell stories using metaphors about cars. But as you heard, I'm not really a software engineer either. And so instead of doing that, I'm going to take that architect part of my job title and say, let's make building analogies. And so I'd like you all to imagine a city, and to think about this city from the perspective of your discipline. Because we represent in this room many, many different disciplines that think about this information. When I work with the people I work with, they come from these other disciplines. And they're all thinking about a city. But if you're a museum, what you think about are the buildings. You say, oh, these buildings, these are these amazing physical structures. And I really care about the important buildings, because that's what museums are good at. They're really good at focusing on exceptional objects and explaining them in context. But if you talk to a librarian, librarians aren't as interested in the buildings themselves. What they're really interested in are the addresses. How do you get access to these buildings? How do you find them? How do you get to those things? How do you provide access to this city that we are all imagining? And if I think about archivists are really interested in zoning. They care about organization. They care about structure. They care about what are the different classifications and what's the context these buildings exist in. If we don't have neighborhoods, they're just a bunch of bricks in a pile. And if I think about the scholars could care less about the actual buildings. They're interested in the people, in the lived experience, in those stories that are enabled by this city. And you need all of these things. We're not describing different cities when we talk about these different disciplinary views onto that information. Instead, we're all talking about different perspectives that we bring to that city. And when I think about my job here, my job is not to be an archivist. My job is not to be a museum professional or a librarian. My job is to take that knowledge, that perspective, and codify it down into data, into useful, structured information. And when I do that, I have to take that reality that we're all describing and make it abstract, make it simple, make it really dumb and stupid and remedial. And because Brian Cantwell Smith, who's one of my favorite philosopher computer scientists, says that when you design and build a computer system, you first have to formulate a model of the problem you want it to solve, and then construct the computer program in those terms. And so when he tells this story in The Limits of Correctness, he tells a story about early warning missile systems. And so on October 5th, in the 1960, the missile warning system came and indicated that there was a missile coming towards the United States. There wasn't a missile, we're all still here. What happened is the moon had come up, and the radar started reflecting off the moon and bounced back. And the people who had written the computer software to detect missiles had never thought about the moon. And so they hadn't thought about it, and so all the warnings went off, and they quickly figured out that the moon wasn't a missile. But the question that I'm really interested in is, whose fault was that? Because, it wasn't that the programmers were wrong. They hadn't thought about, they wrote the software that was supposed to do. It was detecting missiles. And it wasn't the moon's fault. It was doing what it does every day. And it wasn't anybody's fault. What it was is that the simplification of reality that they'd chosen was too simple. It was the wrong representation of reality. And every representation of reality that we come up with is going to be the wrong representation. He also goes on to say that every act of conceptualization, analysis, categorization does a certain amount of violence to its subject matter to get at the underlying regularities that group things together. This is what I do in your fields, is I take the incredible wealth of knowledge that all of you have, and I take a giant hammer and I knock all of the sharp edges and all of the interesting bits off to put them into a machine to help the machine be more regular, to do things with it. Because if you think about it, a one-to-one scale map of the world, a computer program that represents everything in reality, is not a really useful abstraction of the world. It's too complicated, it's too nuanced, it's too interesting to be useful for anything that I could do with it. Because I'm not talking to scholars, I'm not talking to academics, I'm talking to computers, and they're the dumbest thing that I have ever worked with in my entire life. But it's important when I think about what I'm doing, and even more when you think about what I'm doing, to realize that there will never be a correct data model. Nothing I do will ever be right. But my hope is that it may instead be useful. And I think a lot of what I'm doing here is trying to talk through the distinction between something that is correct versus something that is useful. And so to think about that, if I think about, again, the work that we do as memory institutions, we structure and we record information about objects. And we do this because those objects are representation of shared cultural knowledge. But again, there are lots and lots of ways to think about objects. And many of you do this as part of your job on a daily basis. So let's talk about 7 different ways that you can look at objects. And again, like the city, none of these are the right way to think about an object, but they may be useful ways to think about objects. So first, I'd like you to imagine an object as a thing. We've got a vase, we've got a painting, we've got a book. It's a real thing. It exists in space and time. It's got weight, it's got size. And people like me have worked on data models that describe objects as things. The CRM, which we've talked about a lot over the past 2 days at the museum here, is one way. So is schema.org, so is CDWA, so is MARC. These are ways that you describe physical objects. But objects also exist in contexts. We don't ever think about objects by themselves. Often we put them into groups, into collections. We organize them, we summarize them. This is one of the most human things that you can do. And they provide context and meaning to the objects as part of a much larger whole. A vase by itself is a bunch of pottery. It's a bunch of clay. A collection of vases tells the story of a culture. And so we have data models that help us talk through these sorts of organizational structures, these contextualizations of objects. But we also know that objects aren't always unique. Books, there are many, many copies of the same book. There are many, many copies of the same film. There's many, many copies of the same print. And that shared heritage that they have, the connections between these things, help us understand that object, not in isolation as a single magical thing, but as part of something that many, many people can participate in. And again, we have data models that help us talk through this. Objects also have proxies. Much of the work that people like me do, or people like you do, is to digitize, to document, to represent this information, not just the physical object, but the information object. And so those information objects also have information. If we take a photograph, that photograph has data about it. If we write a record in our collections management system, when we wrote that, who wrote that? It's not about the object, it's about the information object about that object. We also manage these objects. We have rules about who can do them, who can see them, who can carry them, what temperatures they have to be stored at, what restrictions we have around that. It's another way to look at objects and another thing that we model. Objects can be representations. A painting, if you don't talk about what that painting is about, is just a bunch of goop on canvas. But that goop on canvas can be a portrait of someone. It can depict history. It can tell a story. And those stories are just as important as the object itself. A book is just paper, but a book is also a way to communicate knowledge to somebody else. And so what those embodied really matters and helps us understand objects not just as physical things, but as important pieces of our culture. And finally, objects themselves are intellectual works. Everything that is made makes an argument. We make them with intent, and that intent can be communicated. They're parts of genres. They help us understand the world. The things we make help define the world that we make. This is the one place I would say that we don't yet know how to model. This work of argumentation, I can find examples, I can talk to you about data models for everything else. But I think this is the most important and the hardest part of those data models, and so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But know that this is one of those areas that we really do need the work of scholarship, because the modalities that I can communicate in, I don't know how to structure this information. And in all of this, it's really overwhelming because there are so many ways that everything that we interact with, everything that you guys take care of and display and present, can be represented in many, many ways. And so when I think about problems like this, I think about a quote from Carl Sagan that says, if you want to make an apple pie, you have to start with the entire universe. There is no way to get to this without thinking about everything. But I also think of another quote, which is, the only way you can eat an elephant is one bite at a time. We don't have to solve every problem here to get to that end goal. I also think that if I have to choose between elephant and apple pie, I know exactly what I'm going to go for. And so what I'd like to do is talk you through some of the lessons I learned as I've tried to solve these problems in a practical project, which is Art Tracks, which is the project I was originally brought into cultural heritage for, to talk about the history of ownership art. And so if I'm thinking about a data model that represents the history of art, how would I express it? And as you know, Art Tracks, as I was telling you, Art Tracks started out with this drawing, which a colleague of mine, Lulu Lippincott, drew on a piece of paper and handed to me when I started and said, look at this. This is the history of a Van Gogh painting that we have in our collection. I drew it going back and forth across the ocean. Isn't this really cool? Could you do this on your computer? And this is what got me really excited about the project. And as you know, she knows this because she's an expert, but we don't have any data to actually do this. What we have is this, which is unstructured text. And many of you are art history professionals. You can read this and you can imagine from these words on paper that map that we just showed. My computer is not nearly smart enough to do that. And so what I thought was going to be a 3-month project of building that map and drawing little arrows turned into this enormous project where we started helping you help the computer understand how that art worked. And we worked on it, and we worked on it, and a year and a half later, we actually drew that map for Lulu so she could see that work going. And then we went and said, that's great, but we did it all bespoke, we did it all custom. What could we do to make it bigger? And what can we do to start linking this information out? Because naively, not coming from the museum, I stepped into the field and I Googled and said, what do museums do? And all the blog posts and all the conference talks I saw said, museums do linked data. We should do linked data. And I said, oh, that's what everyone does. Let's do linked data. It turns out that this wasn't actually what people did. It's what people gave conference talks about. And so here I am giving a talk about it, but as we try to actually do it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what linked data means to me, and I'm not going to talk about the open part. I'm sure you've all heard open access conversations. I'm not going to talk about whether or not we should share our data. That is not my concern. That's your guys' concern. There's people in the room who care a lot more about this than I do. But what I want to talk about is, why do we want to share that information? Why do we create this information? Because if we don't know why we're doing this, we can't know why we want to link it. We can't know why it is useful. And so when I look at an organization like this, I say, are you a publisher? Do you want to publish information? And you publish, but you don't just publish information. So you're not Random House. You generate information. You create it. You create it so that you can then publish it. And are you researchers? Because you do research to create that new information. But you aren't academics who are out researching anything that you want. You research specific objects. You research specific concepts that are part of the work of this organization. Because when I think about organizations like the Philadelphia Museum of Art, or like the Getty, or any of the organizations I've worked with, in my mind, the definitive characteristic of it is that it's a collecting organization. We collect objects, and we collect them, and we research them, and we preserve them, not just the object itself, but that information around the context of that object, the people, the events, the topics that give them meaning. Because an object by itself is not important. We don't collect exceptional objects just because they're beautiful. We collect them because they're part of a larger story that we tell about ourselves. And so this has been the promise of linked data, is to say, what makes objects important is that they are connected organizations. They're part of a social network of art. They reach out to people, they reach out to events, they reach out to the history. And this was the promise of linked data, that if we create a technical standard that allows that sort of data to be shared and reused across the boundaries, and that if computers could automatically do it, we could learn more about the objects based on their own relationships. And this has been a magical future that we've been talking about for 35 years now. And we've talked about how it's going to enable artificial intelligence, that we could record our information and the computer will tell us new insights about what we do. We've been told that if you formulate your data, it will make it really easy for us all to collaborate, that you and I won't even have to talk. We'll just pull each other's data and new insights will emerge out of it. That automatically we'll be able to share what you know and what we know and join them together using the magic of computers. And that it would make all of our lives easier. I'd like you to know none of that has actually happened. Linked data is not a magic bullet. It does not automatically solve any of the problems that we all suffer from. Most of those problems are not solved by a data model. And linked data is one of many data models. It's a data model that's particularly good at representing networks of information. Most of those problems that you're hearing about are solved by communication and collaboration and the hard work that you all do every day. And so, this is what we came back to ArtTracks for and said, knowing what we've learned over 2 years of trying to build out these applications, how can we use the technology that we've learned to talk about the information that we have and know what we do know about linked data? Because there are benefits to it. And we worked to understand what those benefits were and how we could use them. And so this is stuff that you probably know about, but what we have in our universe are content management systems. Sometimes we call them collections management systems. They're data systems that you type into that hold the information that we have. But the purpose of doing that is not to have a bunch of information in a form. Often the goal that we want, at least when people are talking to me, is to take scholarship, to take new learning and put it online. That's one of the goals of putting information into a data management system. Some of them are back-of-house tasks, some of them are this presentation of new knowledge. And then we've got this linked data thing, which is what we're talking about, and that we haven't really said how it helps do either of those things. And so the other concept that I'd like to talk to you about are documents and graphs. And so if I've got a whole bunch of information, if I've got a record about an artwork, there's two ways that I could represent this. One is as a list of information that I print out that describes that object. The other one is as a set of relationships between that object and other objects. And I think about this a lot as an analogy between what LinkedIn is and what LinkedIn wishes it was. What LinkedIn is a resume. It's a big list of information about me that I wrote out that describes David Newbury. What LinkedIn wishes it was Facebook. And Facebook knows, I haven't put any information about Facebook about myself in a really long time. It knows my name, it knows whatever age I told it. I'm not actually 97 years old. And it probably knows I've uploaded a couple of photos. But what Facebook knows about me and what LinkedIn doesn't know about me is who I talk to, what parties I've been to, what events I go to, what other people are talking about me. That connection of interactions between people mediated by events, by objects, by other things. And it turns out that's a much richer source of information. So LinkedIn knows nothing at all about me, and Facebook knows far too much about me. But it's that difference between the relationships between objects and just the data about the object itself. And the other thing that we have in the middle here is this thing called JSON. And developers in the room know what that means. But what that is a way, it's the tool that we all use as computer people to easily record information in a way that the computer can understand it. It's what we use to build websites. And so what we end up with is we've got these documents which go really nicely into our collections management systems because it's how we describe information. We write down what we know about it. And we've got the JSON, which is how it comes out and gets pushed up back online. Then we've got this linked data, and we're trying to figure out what it is we can do with this. Because it's a more complex, richer, more nuanced understanding of those relationships, not just the description of the thing. And so as I started to explore what you could do with this, I ended up with thinking about 4 different levels of a provenance record. And before we get into any provenance, we end up with basic tombstone information. We know an object, it has an owner, it has a creator. This is the information that we all record. You need this, but this is what the document tells us, is just these bare facts. But when we start getting into basic provenance, when we start describing a document that describes it, that describes the history of that transfer that takes place over time, it begins to get a little richer, because we've now gone from just a description of information to thinking about that information as it takes place over time. And I think that's one of the most important things that we do when we talk about linked data, is we realize the information that we have doesn't stay static. Information changes, and we're recording information not at a point, but the life of an object over time as it interacts with things. But that's not enough to get us very far. The other thing is, if you're going to describe those interactions, you have to describe the other things it interacts with. And it's not enough to describe them as words, because I am not friends with BECCA. I'm friends with Becca, who's a person who has other information associated with her. And if I can't get to that information, it's not a very helpful network. And the way we do that is through linking to other authorities. Because what it means is that the person who owned the artwork is just as important as the artwork and needs to be described. And authority and authorities is really a question of 2 things. It's a question of identity and a question of trust. Because we have to know who that person is to have that document, but we also have to trust that that document, that those records about that person are valid. And so when you create an authority record, when you give something an identity and say, BECCA is this record, what you're saying is, I am making a claim about that. And we are in the business here in Philadelphia of making claims about things. But we also all know, because it's our job, that making those claims is not a free thing to do. It's really easy for me to make a claim about anything in the world. I can go and say that that I made all the sculptures in your museum, and they're all made of bubblegum. That's not a really valid claim. To do it right, to be authoritative, to be trustworthy, takes time and resources. The work of catalogers, the work of curators, the work of librarians, the work of archivists. And because the world is incredibly enormous. And when we get beyond just describing the objects that we have, but also the people that they interacted with, and the events, and the places, we have to describe everything in the universe, because everything interacts with everything else. We're all part of a big system. And our budgets are less big than the world is big. So I think the question is, how can we be authoritative without describing everything? And to think about that, we have to realize there's multiple ways that you can be an authority. There's this idea of asserted authority, when you want to be the authority for something. And so here, you want to be the authority for the objects in your collection. You have decided that I am the moral authority, it is my job, it is my responsibility to provide records, to provide data, to be a source of truth for this information. We are making a claim. It is not, we're not saying no one else can make a claim, but we are saying we are in a position to make a valid claim about a thing. And that's the work that we do here when we describe our objects. But there are other forms of authority. We could also say, we are not the people to make an authoritative claim about this. And so often what happens is you end up with these shared authority files. I'm from the Getty, I'm pretty fond of the Getty vocabularies. So if I say I want to describe the concept of gold, there's been a team of researchers who for 30 years have been describing art history terms. They say this is the authority for gold. And I'm not sure if you guys use AAT or not, but if you do, you've said, we are not going to spend a week documenting what gold is. We're going to say, they did the work, we trust them. It doesn't mean that the Getty is right. It just means that you trust us enough to let us do the work and you not have to do it. And then there's a third kind of authority, and this is where I talk about the local heroes problem. There's a lot of things that you don't want to be the authority for, but nobody else is willing to do it yet. And so I think this is one of the challenges that we have as a field, is it would be lovely if there was an authority file that had every interesting person in the world in it. But that doesn't exist. When I was at Pittsburgh, we had a donor who had donated his baseball card collection to the museum, and we had accessioned it. And I guarantee you that donor does not exist in any authority record anywhere else. He was just a guy with a really good baseball card collection who wanted to give it to a museum. We need a record for him. We are not the right people to be the authority for that man's life. But somebody has to do it. And so we end up with this reluctant authority. One of our jobs is to mint what I think of as these micro-authorities, some way to create a local controlled authority for things that we don't care about but that we have to maintain. And so one of the challenges we have as a field is what are tools that we can do to maintain and create these little local authority files, things that we aren't willing to give the resources we give to our objects or to the things that we do care about, but that we do have to maintain. And so when I think about what we're doing, that's the first challenge, is to say, if we're going to link out to these other parts of the universe, what can we do with authority? The second question is, as we get closer and closer to describing these things, we end up describing the nature of those relationships. To say, I've got this person and I've got this artwork, and they are connected somehow, but we have to describe how they're connected. And so this is the second thing that linked data gives us, not just a way to define authorities and point to them, but a way to define when I point to that person, why am I pointing to it, and what is the meaning of that relationship that you and I have, so that we know that we're talking about the same thing. We can do that in JSON. I can just write up a description, and I understand exactly what it means because I wrote it. But no one else in this room understands what any of this means because it's what I came up with out of my own head. This is what we did for the first version of ArtTracks, and it didn't work for anyone else because you needed me. And so when I think about what we're doing, we need to come together as a community and start defining shared terminology that we're going to use in these sorts of relationships. And so when I think about linked data, I think about defining a good enough meaning for what we do. And it's not going to be perfect, but if I'm saying, I sold an object to you, that's a transfer of custody. And I'm going to go and point to somebody else's documentation about what we mean by transfer of custody, so that you can go read that documentation and I can read it, and we can come to a shared understanding of meaning between those two things. And that's the second benefit of linked data, is that we can share meaning between these systems. And so one of the tools that we use is CDOC-CRM, which is this long ontology that a bunch of academics have worked on 30 years that describe the nature of objects and relationships in that object-ish world. So what this does is it means that the description of that provenance becomes more complicated. This is that same record. It's much, much more complicated, but it's more complicated because it's captured a bunch of the nuance that I didn't understand because I haven't spent 30 years thinking about this problem. And so it's more complicated, but all that complication is documented, it's understood, somebody else can think about it, and you don't have to come find me. There are now experts who understand this, and so more than just me can understand this. And so that works really well as long as that team of academics who are all in Crete and have thought about this for 30 years have described everything that you care about. I'd like you to know that they haven't thought about everything that you care about. They're still working on it, they're still thinking. But there are going to be gaps in knowledge. There's going to be things that you want to talk about that they haven't talked about. And so this is another one of the benefits of linked data, is it's designed to let you take that underlying framework and then build upon it. It's not as rigorous as a data standard. It's more rigorous than just whatever that I want. It lets me take, and so what I did in ArtTracks was I said, I can define what a transfer of custody is, but nobody has gone down and documented what are all the different ways that objects can be transferred. And so I worked with scholars and researchers and curators and came up with a more complex ontology that I could just glue onto the work that the team in Crete had already done. And that's one of the benefits, is you aren't constrained by just the requirements. You can grow, but I didn't have to invent the entire universe from scratch. I can just build my little branch of that apple tree. and I can document it. And so I can write it down in that same sort of format so other people can build on top of it. And so I think the third thing that we end up with here, once we've gotten past what are the authorities and how do we document those relationships, is understanding that I am not going to have all of the information that describes that entire universe. Other people are doing research. Other people have that information. And so when I'm talking about the events in this provenance record, this artwork was sold at an auction. And it turns out that the Getty has been working on recording auction information for a really long time. And so what I want to say is, how do I collaborate with the Getty in a way, and this is before I worked at the Getty, how would I collaborate with another institution who's also doing work in a way that doesn't require full, we're going to sit down in a room for 6 months and collaborate? What's a minimum viable collaboration look like? And I think that's one of the things that they did. And so they were working on the provenance index. I'm now working on the provenance index. And we said, if we had done traditional metadata aggregation, because our friends at Yale are also working on provenance, if we all sat down and said, what is this information that we can share, and came up with what Carnegie knew and what the Getty knew and what Yale knew, and said, what are those fields that we all share in common? Can we document those? We would have ended up with this little tiny pie of information that we all share together. What I want to do is not have that level of rigor, and instead have, we will share as little as possible, but we will link to each other so that a researcher can get to the richness of all of our records with all of the nuances of each of our collecting practices in between. There are benefits for that collaboration, there's benefits for consistency, but there's even more benefits, in my opinion, to just being able to follow your nose to other sources of information to find that richness of other people's practices. And so this is what we ended up with as a description of how we understand provenance. It is more complicated than that original block of text, but it links to other people. It links to the authorities, and it's understandable by machines. But there's one other level of complexity in what we were doing. And I think about this as the fourth level, the one we didn't do. And that's about the unattainability of complete knowledge. Because if we go back to where we started, no data model is going to capture everything that we need. But we may at some point learn that we need more data that we had. We need to refine our model. What we don't want to do is throw away everything and start over. We knew this because we ended up getting to the point where we recognized that if I sell an artwork to you, there's often a bunch that goes on there. You know, it gets shipped off to a dealer, and it gets packaged and actually transferred into an auction house and moved back. And we said, we know this is a problem, but we're not going to solve this problem today. We would just build enough framework that when the next person comes along to solve that problem, we've given them a hook. And so when I think about linked data, what I'm thinking about are 4 things that we need to do. It's how do we make it easy to share authority, to be authoritative about the things that we do care about, and let other people be authoritative about the areas of their expertise. How do we share understanding? How do we say, I know something, you know something, let's write it down in a way that we can both point to that shared understanding rather than have the miscommunication. It may not be as good as what I know, but it's good enough for what we're doing right now. And what other ways can I do to ease that collaboration that don't require us to fully share that, but to link together? And how do we plan for the future? How do we know that we're never going to get it good enough today, but give us enough flexibility that we can be better tomorrow? And so when I think about what linked data does, what the method of data modeling that I'm using in the work that I do, that you guys are looking at for the work that you're doing, the reason I'm looking at that data model is not to create web-scale AI, not to enable amazing reconciliation or automation, but to help us think through these problems. Because these are the problems I think that we really need to solve if we're going to move our field past where we are right now and into a more connected, more global universe. And so, again, when I think about my job, I'm thinking about 2 things. One is data, which is what we've just talked about. The other one is the software itself, the tools that we use once we have this data model to do something with it. Because nothing we've talked about up to this point actually needs a computer to do it. It helps, but all we talked about so far is writing documents and sending them back and forth to read. Now, you all know that JSON documents are not the best way for me to share knowledge with anyone in this room. It's really inefficient, it hurts your eyes, they have all these squiggly brackets that don't mean anything. We don't do this so that we can communicate. We do it because they need to be digital. And they need to be digital so that software can do something with it. It's not enough to publish your documentation. It's not enough to digitize just so it can be digitized. We digitize stuff, we document stuff so that we can use it. Because that's what makes data useful, is not just the structure, not just the organization, but the use of that information. And so when I think about software, I keep trying to come up with a way I can describe what software does that makes sense to someone who doesn't spend their entire life typing. And I think about software often as a way to automate practice, to say, if I can understand what you do well enough, or what I do well enough, that I can write down in exhaustive detail for the stupidest thing in the universe, I can teach that stupid thing to do it for me so I don't have to do it anymore. And that's the process of what we try to do with software. But we can only do it if we understand it well enough that we can explain it. And that is, I think, a lot of the work that's what makes my job useful. That's the value that people like me can bring to your organization, is that we can help sit down with you and understand what you do. And if you can help us find the places that you can explain well enough, we can help automate it and make it more efficient. There are many, many things that you can do that you don't understand well enough that you can explain it to me, much less to a computer. Humans are incredibly brilliant, they're incredibly intuitive, they're really, really good at value judgments. I can't teach a computer to make value judgments, I can't teach it to be intuitive, so any part of your job that requires that, you have to keep doing. And I think of my job as freeing up as much of your time to be intuitive, to make value judgments, to take the boring parts away from your practice so that you can be human, because that's what you're best at doing. And so when I think about the sorts of tasks that I want to enable, why am I using digital tools? What do I want it to enable? I think about three things. I think about describing the work of recording this information. I think about researchers who want to use digital methods to take this information that you've created and understand in bulk the universe of it. And I also think about people like me who want to do this kind of work. But if I think about those three people who are working in your data, the researchers who are using it, the catalogers who are recording it, and people like me who want to consume it, the cataloger wants to be as accurate as possible. They want to structure the real world. The researchers want to ask questions that nobody has ever asked. If you've already written it down, they don't care about it because it's already known. They want to know new things. And me, I want structure, I want organization, I want rigor. We can't do all of these things all of the time. We're really at conflict. And so we have to come up with an understanding of what actual tasks we want to accomplish so we can find a place where it's good enough for all three of these use cases. And so in the research that I've done, which is really reading research that many other people have done, some of whom are in this room, we end up talking about the three tools that we're really good at are searching and browsing and displaying. Those are the three of the things that we can help and facilitate: finding information, displaying that information so you can read it, and then helping you find links to other information that are relevant and related. Libraries have known about this much longer than I have. It turns out if you go and read what other people write, you can learn a whole lot. But these are the sorts of tools that technology can help us accelerate. One of the other lessons we've learned in doing this is that those relationships really matter. And so if all we do is describe our objects, it turns out the artists are just as important. And a lot of the relationships are not between objects, they're between people. We also know that the concepts are really important, the subjects of the artwork. And if we're going to do our job well and describe this network of information, we have to say the object is important, but it is not the only primary entity. We have to think about all of the parts that make up this network of relationships. And the last thing that we've learned that I can share with you is that what makes it really valuable are those links between things. And so anywhere where you can find a relationship to something else, recording those links makes this rich. It's what takes us from being LinkedIn to being Facebook. The other thing I've learned as I've put this into practice is that you have to use the data. It's not enough to just write it down, because it's really easy to write it down and never know whether or not you can use it again. That doesn't meet my use case as a technologist, because you can write data that is so complex that no one can read it. Just like you can write a paper that is so complex that no one can understand it. You need to have that reader, you need to have that person who's going to interpret the work to know whether or not it's valuable. And it's not enough to be correct. You have to be correct and sufficient. It also really matters the structure of this information for me, because it doesn't matter if you've recorded everything accurately if you're not consistent. And that's not because the data is lost, it's because my computers are so stupid that if you say the same thing 2 different ways, it doesn't know that it's the same thing. And so as we've taken these lessons that we've learned, as we've taken the work from Art Tracks and also the work of many other people, the work that you guys are doing, the work that our colleagues at Yale, people all across the world, we've come together and said, we need to take the work of linked data and make something which we're calling LOUD, or linked open usable data. Take the lessons of the semantic web, take the things that we've learned that you can actually do with this, and say, for our field, what are those patterns? What are those related ways that we can do it? And so we've been working as an organization and as a community that many people in this room are part of on a project called Linked Art, which is to say, what are a set of patterns that people like me can use to understand information that people like you are recording? This is a giant wall of text for technologists who want to understand actually what we're doing in lots and lots of acronyms. But it really is just a way to say, we're building on the shoulders of giants, we're using work that other people have done in other disciplines, and we're figuring out how it applies to our discipline today to represent what we know out to the world. And we're trying to balance complexity and usability. My colleague Rob loves this graph, because as you get more and more data in your universe, as you describe stuff more and more completely, if you have no information, it's utterly useless. And as soon as you have that basic tombstone data, it gets more and more useful. But then as you start adding everything that you know, as it gets more and more complicated, as it takes more and more time to understand the data that you have, the usability of it starts to fall off a cliff. Because you're starting to go from representing an abstraction of the world to representing everything about that world. And so what we're trying to do is find that place, not at the peak of the graph, a little bit past, because we know you guys. You're not going to be happy with bare minimum. But let's try to get to the point where we haven't fallen all the way into uselessness, but we're still meeting the needs of us. We aren't as practical as underwear sales, but we really, really do care about not only understanding the world, but sharing it out to other people, to present this to the world. And so that's what we're doing, is we're trying to take the complexity of that network, encode it in a way that makes sense for developers, to hide some of that complexity, hide some of it in practice, hide some of it in standards, hide some of it in the cleverness of this community coming together to find patterns and write them down, so that we can create that standard data model to help software developers work with the modeling of information that you're already doing. And so that's, I think, a lot of the work that I've been doing. We know how to describe objects. The disciplines that many of you come from, librarians, archivists, catalogers, registrars, excel at that. We're learning how to describe relationships. We're learning from people like Facebook using their tools. We're learning from academics at the W3C, in the C.CRM community, all across the world, as we learn how computers can work with these kind of complex relationships. And so I'd like to leave you with 2 things. First, 3 problems that we are currently thinking about, things that we have learned as we talk to people like you that we don't know how to solve, and that we'd like your help to solve as we try to understand how best to present this linked open usable data. The first problem is the problem of complexity. We know that you want to model nuance. We know you want to understand these complexities, because that's what makes this information so valuable. That's what you excel at. And so one of the problems that we're struggling with and that we were working with is every time we raise that complexity bar, how do we raise the amount of help that we can give people like software developers to balance every step forward in complexity? Every new nuance has to be met with something that helps simplify that problem, because it's always going to get more complex. And so my job and the job of all of us here is to say, how do we work together to make the complex simple so that we can express the complex? The second problem is the problem of context. We know that the museum has a point of view. We know that all data that we represent has a point of view. And so one of our questions is, how can we use this complex technology that we have to represent that point of view so that you can ask questions about objects or about relationships, but ask it from a point of view? To say, I want to know not what Philadelphia thinks about this object, but what a dealer in 1900 thought about this object. We have enough data that we can start answering those questions, but we need to work with you to say, how do we formulate those questions, both from a technology standpoint, but also understanding what those questions are and how you would ask them. Because again, as we have that complexity of querying up, we have to make it easier for us to do it and easier for you. Because you can't just type into a Google search box that question. We need to work on the user interfaces that work with your understanding of the world and with our understanding of the world. And the final problem that we know we have is the problem of change. Records change over time, our understanding of objects change over time. How do we not just ask from the point of view of different disciplines or the point of view of different people, but to say, what did we know about this object in 1950? What did we know about this object last week? Because our objects change, what we know about them changes, we reattribute artworks, we discover new things, and it's useful to know what we knew then. The academic community has solved this with citation and with publication, but we live in an environment where everything is connected and everything is changing. How do we mimic that citation environment, also with the richness of data that we can update every day? And so those are the three problems that I'm thinking about and that I'm hoping people like you can help me think through. Because the work of automating these sorts of tasks is hard, but the work of understanding what we're trying to do is even harder. And so a lot of what I'm trying to, this is not a solved problem. I can't come and give you the answers. I can come and tell you that we are working on these answers. But the other thing I want to leave you with is the success, which is I'm in a room with about 50 other people who are listening to me talk about linked data in museums. 5 years ago, I could talk to a room of 5 people, all of whom knew what I was talking about. And 5 years ago, there was nobody talking about this. What I have seen is that the enthusiasm, the potential of this is no longer something that's a bunch of academics in a room in Crete saying, wouldn't it be great if people cared about this? I see an enthusiasm for collaboration. I see an enthusiasm for openness. And I see an enthusiasm for doing the work of structuring what you have to enable uses that you haven't imagined yet. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, for listening to me talk about data, and for letting me try to share some of what I've learned over the past 5 years with all of you. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, David, for coming. He's been with us for 2 days now, and he gave such a great talk. After talking for 2 days, I'm very excited that your brain is still working and you're keeping our brains moving as well. So we do have time for questions.
Hi. It seems like last autumn, the issue of linked data hit an even wider audience when Vint Cerf talked about how the web has failed and what he would like to see done with it. How do you see the concepts that he's presented and the platform that he has created affecting or helping this out?
I think you, in institutions like this, one of the reasons linked data has thrived in cultural heritage more than anywhere else is because of this culture of openness. You're willing to share your information with others, which is that first prerequisite. And I think what Vint Cerf wants is a universe in which information is free and which information can be shared. And so I think the more he can do to encourage other people to participate, to open up new avenues of authority that we can link to, will help us in our process. We're building on the same tools that he's building on. We're trying to do what he's proposing. Other questions?
Thank you. I was wondering if we could go back to one of your current problems, the idea of point of view. And I wondered what you've seen at the Key or here or at other cultural institutions in terms of balancing the interest in the authority of the institutional voice versus all of the players or actors within that institution that have points of views that change over time.
I think one of the biggest benefits that an organization like this can do is provide an identity for those things that it wants to be the authority for. If you want to have a different point of view about the Diana sculpture that you have, and you want other people to recognize that you're making a different argument than, say, the Philadelphia Museum of Art's preferred argument, but you want people to know you're talking about that, you have to both point to the same thing. And so I think the most important role that we can play is providing that stable identity so that there can be a discourse around it. And so that's the first thing that we can do, is help be a stable point of reference. The other thing we can do is to work on democratizing the tools that we use to make those arguments so that other people can make it. And my feeling is that will actually be really freeing for institutions like this, because before, the publishing the identity and the argument went so closely together that it was hard to pull those apart. If we can use technology to say, those are two different services that we're providing to the field, both saying this is a thing that you can talk about and this is our opinion about it, I think frees institutions to be more opinionated, to have more of a voice, and to allow other people to also have that voice. Because I don't think we all know we can't be neutral. We do have a voice. I don't think it's our job necessarily to tell every story about every object from every point of view. We can't do that, and I don't know that we should. But we should open up those identities so other people can make those stories and help enable the discovery of other people's stories. We should tell our view of our story, but we should let other people tell their views and link to us.
Hi, excuse me. I was been thinking a lot about what you refer to as the problem of change and of how we encode differing information of a thing as it was described over time without losing track of when that description happened and where it came from, and the documents that give it to us and things like that. And I agree, it's really naughty. Do you think, or can you point to other knowledge domains or areas of data that might help us understand these issues? Because I know nothing about what's going on in the sciences or in mapping, but where we have successive ideas of a thing that remains the thing even as it's changed over time, and yet each description of that thing is completely different, or maybe completely different in any single point, regardless that it stayed the same.
I think, so I have two answers. The easy answer is that I've been really interested in the work that people like the Internet Archive are doing in maintaining, using tools like Memento, which is a technology for versioning information, to technically ask that kind of question. It's what tools like the Wayback Machine are built on. If we can start providing that same sort of interface that says, here's our record, but here it is successively back in time, being able to say, what was it at this point of time, doesn't get us all the way, but it gets us closer. But I think one of the things that makes the humanities more interesting than science is that I'm not as convinced that we believe that there's an objective reality. And so the sciences don't have this problem the same way that we do, because they believe that they are refining something that's closer and closer to truth. And so they don't really care what we believe the weight of silver was 300 years ago. It's interesting as a historical fact, but it's not essential to their work and their scholarship. I don't think we believe that in our domain, that kind of objective reality, we are not refining our metadata till it's closer and closer to the truth. And so I think this is one of the reasons that we're on that vanguard of understanding this, because we really do care about multiple interpretations, all of which can be equally true at the same time. And that's not that is a problem of the humanities. And it's one that, technology comes out of the sciences, it comes out of math, it comes out of a underlying belief that if you're just logical enough, you will come to the right answer. And so we're really misusing technology, a tool, my friend Alison Langmead refers to it as like the forbidden fruit of computers, is that computers at their very core believe that if you are just count high enough and count fast enough, you'll come to truth. Nobody in this room, I hope, believes that's to be true. It's a really useful way to think about the world. But a lot of what makes our job so much fun is that we're trying to say, if we pretend that that's true just long enough to use a computer, can we still also record the nuances that really only work in argumentation, that work in discourse, the tools that the humanities uses to ask those same sorts of questions that are really hard to answer? So there's not a good answer to your question, but I think it's one of the areas that I'm most excited to play with.
Also, on the aspect of change, it makes sense, the changes that have occurred in the past, but as research goes forward, other changes will occur. And my understanding of best practices is that the record becomes fixed within a digital archive. Do we have any, has there been any thought about how that record within the archive will be changed going forward?
So we've eaten that forbidden fruit of technology, but we get a lot of benefits out of it. And one of them is that we don't have the storage problems that museums have. And you guys are not generating so much knowledge that you are ever going to run into storage problems with metadata. And so the best practice is every time you change the record, you store another copy of it. It makes my problem a little harder because I do now have to get to the right version of that record. But all of you working together are never going to outpace the speed at which hard drives get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's an information management problem, but it's not going to be an information storage problem. We don't run out of linear feet of disk space.
Thanks, Juliet. I'm back. And so this came up yesterday with a question about the potential pitfalls and potential aspirations of how standardizing our data and creating commons of data could interact with value systems about arts and cultural heritage, things that are very, very well known and have been very well known and valued for long periods of time versus things that are not well known or have not been valued for long periods of time. And I was really curious to hear your perspective, philosophy, experiences of kind of the best case scenarios of what you've seen as far as kind of surfacing undervalued objects or artists, things, or looking at kind of canonized objects from different perspectives, just sort of going about thinking about objects in along different pathways?
I think that there's not a lot I can do to solve that problem. I think what I can do is make it possible for people to tell multiple versions of a story. But what you're really talking about is priority and about who is willing to pay for the work to tell that story. I can work to make things easier, and easier usually means cheaper. I can work to make things accessible, but I can't work to generate interest, and I can't do the work of telling stories from other points of view. And so I think, if technology can play a role here, one is this proliferation of hard drives. We can make it cheap and easy for many people to tell their stories. And I think that if I do my job well, I can make it really hard for someone to tell whether it was a story that was $100,000 to tell or $10 to tell. That's the benefit I can bring, but I can't tell underrepresented stories, and I can't point people to underrepresented stories. That isn't work of technology, that is work of people. It's work of people like you, not people like me. And so I think I can be an enabler of the priorities that institutions set, and I would love to be an enabler of those priorities, but it's the work of content creation and the work of going out and finding those stories and empowering other people to tell them that I can't solve.
Any questions from the other side of the room? Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank David for his time and his insight. And we'll continue these sorts of programs going forward, so keep an eye out from us. And thank you all.